I used to work for a company called Ground Feeders. Our job was straightforward but grueling. When a client bought a property, we'd go in, tear the ground apart, and prep it for their plans, construction, development, whatever. It often meant chopping down trees, clearing debris, or leveling dirt. This particular job, it was much bigger. We had to lay down a stable foundation for an entire facility. My role? Lead the excavation team and make sure we didn't screw up underground. The site was a nightmare, unstable and unforgiving. We had to dig through an enormous amount of land before we could even begin our primary work. One mistake, one unstable section, and the ground could collapse, burying someone alive. After every shift, it was my job to throw on my hard hat and headlamp, then map out the freshly excavated area to ensure it was safe. That's how I found it. It started like any other late-night shift. We were behind schedule, so I stayed later than usual. Supervisors have it rough. We're always the first ones in and the last ones out. When the crew clocked out, I grabbed my gear and headed down into the site. The silence underground always unnerved me, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I was halfway through the inspection when I saw it. Something sticking out of the ground at the edge of the dig site. At first, I thought it was a tool someone had left behind. Being the decent guy I am, I figured I'd return it to its owner. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a tool. It was a handle. The U-shaped metal piece jutted out from the soil like some terrible relic. My heart began to pound as I clawed at the dirt with my hands. It didn't take long to uncover what it was. A bunker door. I froze. There was no civilization for miles in any direction. What the hell was a bunker doing out here? The door was old, sealed tight, with a rusted turnstile lock. I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know what was inside. It took 15 grueling minutes of wrenching at the lock before it finally gave way with a groan. The smell hit me first. It wasn't just bad, it was gut-wrenching. Rot, decay, and something indescribably vile rolled out in waves. Gagging, I stumbled back to the job site, grabbed a respirator mask, thick gloves, and my heavy-duty flashlight. Whatever was down there, I was going to find out. The latch creaked as I pried the door open again. This time, the mask held back the stench. I shined my flashlight into the darkness. Metal stairs descended into an abyss, ending at another door. Glass this time, with a simple slide lock. I climbed down, my boots clanging against the steel grates, and unlatched the door. Beyond it stretched a long corridor, its walls lined with maps. The facility was massive, sprawling underground like a maze. As I studied the maps, something became clear. This place wasn't just a bunker. It went deeper. 2 more floors beneath the one I stood on. Adrenaline coursed through me as I ripped one of the maps off the wall and pressed forward. The hallway led to a fork, a blast door ahead, and another hallway veering left toward a stairwell. According to the map, the blast door led to a small office. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the door. Inside, the room was eerily intact. A desk sat in the center, surrounded by outdated monitors and equipment. 3 chairs were positioned before stacks of VCRs, microphones, and thick composition notebooks. Each workstation was identical, like someone or something had been running experiments here. The silence was deafening. My eyes landed on the tapes. I grabbed a few, shoving them into my bag. Whatever was on them, I needed to know. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. What was this place? Who had worked there? And why was it buried in the middle of nowhere? Unable to rest, I dragged out an old VCR and TV from my garage. Sitting cross-legged on the floor in my pajamas, I popped in the first tape. What I saw made my blood run cold. The first tape I played was a relic of its time, coated in a thick layer of dust that seemed to whisper of years spent untouched. I slid it into the VCR, the machine groaning like it, too, wanted nothing to do with what was about to unfold. The screen flickered to life, revealing a man in a lab coat. His dark eyes stared directly into the camera, unblinking, as if he could see through the screen. His face was partially obscured by a black mask, leaving only his piercing gaze and jet black hair visible. "Hello, viewers," he began, his voice unnervingly upbeat. "As you've all anticipated, our series premiere begins today." The way he spoke, with forced enthusiasm, felt off. He continued, his tone shifting between excitement and something colder. "We have 4 willing contestants. Your contributions have made this possible. These young men and women will be locked away in our underground facility with no means of entertainment. The location is equipped with a fully functional kitchen, plumbing, and basic electrical needs." He paused, looking off camera briefly, then leaned forward as if to share a secret. "This isn't your typical reality show. There will be no elimination challenges. The only objective is to provide these contestants with pre-cooked human remains." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Their behavior over the next 8 weeks will be observed and documented by our team of specialists," he said, his voice rising with manic glee. "Our subjects are fully aware of the conditions. They are to interact with one another, and we will withdraw any form of contact, aside from a few surprises. At the end, the remaining contestants will receive a rather generous cash prize." The tape cut abruptly to brief interviews with the 4 participants. 2 men and 2 women, a mix of personalities. One of the women seemed strung out, jittery, her eyes darting around. The others looked relatively normal, though their smiles felt forced, their voices strained. The footage transitioned to a surveillance shot of a shared living room. The contestants lounged awkwardly on mismatched furniture, clearly unsure of what to do. A loud buzzing startled them, prompting them to gather in the dining area. Their first meal awaited them. The plates were unassuming: meat, a small portion of vegetables, and a slice of bread. But the tags on each plate told a darker story. One of the men read as aloud. "Male, 28, inner thigh, died of lung disease," he said, his voice laced with disgust. Nervous chatter filled the room. 2 of the men poked at their plates hesitantly, while the women didn't touch theirs at all. "I don't know if I can do this," the blonde woman muttered, her heavily made-up face twisted in horror. "It's one thing when it's disguised as animals, but I can't eat it knowing who it was and how they died. It's psycho." She stormed out, leaving the others at the table. The muscular man, who looked to be in his late 20s, cut a piece of meat and hesitated for only a moment before popping it into his mouth. His face lit up in surprise. "Holy crap! This is incredible. There's no way this is human meat," he said, chewing with gusto. "They're playing mind games, Eddie. Easiest 100 grand I'll ever make." He devoured the rest of his plate, ignoring the horrified stares of his fellow contestants. The second man, heavier and quieter, ate his sides but threw the meat into the trash before leaving the table. The remaining woman, trembling, began to sob. She twisted her dark hair in her hands, her sobs growing louder as she stared at the untouched plate before her. The scene shifted again. Surveillance footage captured the 3 participants in the living room. The muscular man leaned back, smugly dismissing the others' concerns. "I'm telling you," he said, grinning directly at the camera, "it's all a setup. They're trying to get a reaction out of us. That's the point of this show. American television at its finest." He struck a dramatic pose, looking straight into the lens as if he could see me watching. For a moment, I felt like he wasn't just addressing the camera, but me, sitting in the dark alone. The tape dragged on, the monotony of their interactions broken only by the flickering of the screen. I fast-forwarded, skipping to the next significant moment. It was night. The muscular man's bedroom appeared on the screen, bathed in the eerie green glow of night vision. He tossed and turned violently, clutching his stomach. I couldn't tell if it was the food or something far worse that was disturbing him. The scene on the second tape was even worse than the first. It started with a view of the dining room table. For plates sat neatly arranged, each meal prepped and labeled with grotesque tags. A loud buzzing sound filled the air, the same sound that seemed to dictate the contestants' every move. The camera switched between shots of their bedrooms, capturing each person waking up and sluggishly preparing for their day. Fast-forwarding, I stopped at the moment they gathered around the table. The muscular man, let's call him Mr. Muscles, immediately began devouring his breakfast, his hands moving like claws, tearing into the meat with unsettling zeal. The others sat frozen, their faces twisted with dread. The blonde woman, her hands trembling, picked up her meal tag and read it aloud. Female 9 brain matter. Died from an automotive collision. Her voice cracked as she finished, and her face went pale. The darker-haired woman gagged violently, bolting from her chair and vomiting into a trash can. The microphone picked up every wretched sound. She lingered there, panting and wiping her mouth. Then, she looked down into the trash can. Her entire body stiffened. Her eyes widened in horror, her lips quivering as she whispered, "No, no, no, no." The rest of the group sat in stunned silence, except for Mr. Muscles, who continued eating with a sickening lack of restraint. The blonde woman suddenly shouted, "Screw it. If he can do it, so can I." She stabbed a fork into the pile of brain matter and shoved a piece into her mouth. Her reaction was instantaneous. Her face lit up with a grotesque mix of shock and pleasure. "Oh my God! It's amazing," she said, her voice shaky but filled with satisfaction. The older man hesitated, his hands shaking as he picked up his fork. "To hell with it," he muttered, taking a cautious bite. Then another. Soon, he was devouring his plate, just as greedily as the others. The camera zoomed in on the plates as they scraped them clean, each contestant making sure no crumb was left behind. Meanwhile, the dark-haired woman, still pale and trembling, silently left the room, retreating to her bedroom. The camera followed her as she collapsed onto the bed, curling into a tight ball and refusing to move for the rest of the evening. Back in the living room, the remaining 3 contestants were laughing and chatting like old friends. Their mood was unsettlingly light, their words dripping with praise for the meal. "This food is to die for," the blonde woman exclaimed, throwing her arms into the air with exaggerated enthusiasm. "I feel so alive. It's like I could do anything." "I didn't expect this at all," the older man added, nodding eagerly. "What do you think they're planning for lunch?" Their laughter echoed eerily as the muscular man stood and slipped away. The camera tracked him into the hallway. He walked with a strange determination, his usual arrogance replaced by something more primal. He stopped outside the dark-haired woman's bedroom, pressing his ear to the door. He stayed there listening, his breath slow and shallow. The camera zoomed in on his face, and for the first time, I noticed something wrong. His eyes glinted unnaturally, reflecting the dim light in a way that felt predatory. Suddenly, he straightened up, his head cocked to the side like he was listening to something distant, something the rest of US couldn't hear. The tape ended abruptly, the screen cutting to black. The VCR spit the tape out, the mechanical clunk startling me out of my trance. I sat there, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the table. What was happening in that place? Who were these people, and why did they act like this was normal? I didn't want to watch another tape. I didn't want to see what came next, but something deep inside compelled me. Curiosity, dread, a morbid need for answers. I slid the next tape into the VCR, took a deep breath, and hit play. I couldn't believe what I was watching. The tape felt like a horror movie, but every second of it was real. The way the participants' behavior changed, how they shifted from normal to animalistic, was unsettling beyond words. As I fast-forwarded, the images kept flickering between the conversation in the living room and the disturbing events in the hallway. The young man's eyes, they were full of malice now. His whole demeanor was completely different, as if some primal urge had taken over. What stood out most, though, was how normal he seemed in the beginning. In the first few days, he was like any other person, but after the meals, after the indulgence, something in him had snapped. His transformation was the most chilling part of all of this. The tape ended with the group heading to bed, and I felt my body slump in exhaustion. My eyes were sore, dried out from staring at the screen without blinking. I let out a long yawn and refilled my coffee, my hands still trembling. I couldn't stop now. I had to see what happened next. Tape 3 started the same as the last, but this time, there was something different. The remaining 3 participants, Mr. Muscles, the older man, and the blonde woman, ate without hesitation, diving face first into their meals. They didn't even use silverware. The sounds they made while they ate were animalistic, growling and snarling as if fighting over a kill. The change in them was complete. The woman who had resisted earlier, she finally snapped. She lunged at the older man, claws outstretched, and began tearing into his neck with her bare hands. Her ferocity shocked me. I could hear his screams as he struggled to get her off, but he managed to throw her off with a violent shove. She flew across the room, her body crumpling on the floor. By then, the muscular man had finished his meal, but he didn't stop. He leapt onto the older man's plate and began eating it while he was distracted, ignoring the other's furious glares. The older man, now livid, stood up, his teeth bared. He squared off with Mr. Muscles, sizing him up. It was a standoff. The tension was thick, almost palpable. Then, the young man locked eyes with the camera in the kitchen. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they were hollow, feral. Slowly, he stalked towards the camera, his gaze never leaving the lens. As he drew closer, his face contorted into something unrecognizable, his voice coming through the speakers in a distorted, guttural growl. "I need more." It was almost as if he wasn't human anymore. His teeth ground together, and drool dripped from his mouth, pooling at his chin. I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, the ceiling opened. A flood of severed limbs and organs rained down from the vent, crashing onto the kitchen floor in a disgusting heap. Flesh slapped against the linoleum as entrails swung from the vent like grotesque decorations. The 3 remaining participants dove into the pile, tearing at the bodies with abandon. They devoured the remains like starving animals, tearing flesh from bone in a frenzy. It was an orgy of savagery. When they were done, they lay back on the floor, bloated and satisfied, twisted grins plastered on their faces. The image of them lying there, their stomachs swollen, was burned into my mind. I was shaking now. The coffee in my hand splashed across my shirt, but I barely noticed. My mind was reeling. What had I just witnessed? What were these people? The tape cut to black, but after a few moments of pure darkness, the image returned. This time, it was a split screen. Each screen showed one of the participants sleeping in their beds. Then, like a coordinated attack, they all rose from their beds at once. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical. The glow in their eyes was unmistakable, something primal, something inhuman. They converged in the hallway, and then they went to her room. The girl who had been the only one to resist. She hadn't moved from her bed all day. Maybe she didn't have the strength to anymore. The 3 of them gathered outside her door. The alpha male, Mr. Muscles, was at the front, pushing his way to the door. He turned the knob slowly, and I could hear the creak of the door opening. A sliver of light streamed through the crack. The sound that followed was pure, raw animal instinct. Heavy breathing, saliva dripping onto the floor. Then, without warning, they pounced. The camera captured every horrifying moment. The 3 of them ripping at her, tearing her apart limb by limb. Her screams were deafening. They didn't stop until she was nothing more than pieces scattered across the bed and floor. The room was drenched in blood. The smell was unbearable, even through the speakers. They bathed in her blood, grinning like monsters, savoring the gruesome feast they had made. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I had to force myself to stop watching, but the image was burned into my mind. This wasn't just a game or some twisted experiment. These people, whatever they were now, had crossed a line from which there was no return. And now, I was trapped in this nightmare with them. This final chapter of the nightmare left me completely shaken. The savagery I witnessed on the last tape was beyond comprehension, each second more horrifying than the last. Growls and feral grins dominated the scene as the two remaining men feasted, trading snarls as they tore into the remains of their previous victim. Their inhuman smiles, dripping with gore, lingered long after each mouthful. The once human participants had devolved into pure beasts. If I hadn't been so numb from sleep deprivation, I might have vomited or passed out. But something, curiosity, fear, or maybe just the inability to look away, kept my eyes glued to the screen. The tape cut abruptly after their gruesome meal, only to resume with the two male participants locked in a savage, bloody fight. It was a spectacle of violence as they clawed, bit, and ripped at each other's flesh. Blood sprayed across the room, painting the walls with crimson streaks. The woman was nowhere to be seen, though the camera's shifting angles revealed remnants of organs and limbs strewn around the house. My only assumption was that she had been their earlier victim, her corpse now unrecognizable in the mess. The fight raged on, a relentless battle that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Neither showed any sign of stopping until one lay dead. The muscular man eventually gained the upper hand. With a horrifying display of strength, he grabbed the older man by the remnants of his hair, slammed his head into the floor, and with one final, gruesome motion, severed it entirely. Holding the severed head high, he tilted his own back and let the blood drip into his open mouth. He drank deeply, savoring every drop, before biting into the cheek with a sickening crunch. Then, as if discarding an empty can, he tossed the head across the room. What followed was worse. The victor turned toward the camera, his mouth still full of flesh, and approached the lens. His eyes burned with something primal, something evil. He stared directly into the camera, chewing deliberately. For 30 agonizing seconds, the screen was locked on his face, his expression unchanging, his presence oppressive. Then, with a quiet click, the tape ended. The screen went black and the tape ejected. That soft sound jolted me back to reality, but I wasn't ready to face it. I froze, trembling, my mind racing. What in the absolute hell did I just watch? I scrambled for my phone, intent on calling the police, but something stopped me. The sun was already peeking through the curtains. It was Monday morning. Could I really have been watching for this long? There was no time to waste. I stuffed the tapes into a plastic bag, threw on my clothes, and bolted out the door. My plan was simple. Get to the job site, inform my superior, and hand the tapes over to the authorities. But as I pulled into the site, my heart sank. A white Prius was parked near the office, its side emblazoned with a logo I recognized immediately. It was the same symbol from the contract header and the tapes labels. The truth hit me like a freight train. Our client wasn't a harmless research group. They were the architects of this nightmare. Clutching the bag of tapes, I stormed into the portable office, determined to expose the truth. But my steps faltered when I saw him. A man in a white lab coat sat casually across from my boss. His jet black hair was neatly combed, and he exuded an unsettling calm. "Ah, there you are," my boss snapped, glaring at me. "This is no way to present yourself in front of a client." The man turned to face me. His eyes immediately locked onto the bag in my hand, and his lips curled into a wide, toothy grin. My boss stammered, trying to explain. We found these on site last week. I thought you might want to take a look." "Found them, did you?" The man interrupted, his voice smooth and cold. "These tapes are the property of our client. Anything found on this site belongs to them." Before I could protest, the man snatched the bag from my grip. His smile widened as he clutched it, almost as if he were holding something precious. "Thank you," he said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "These are vital to our research. I'm so grateful for their return." He turned to leave, pausing only to nod politely at my boss. As he walked past me, he glanced back, his grin never faltering. His eyes, however, betrayed something darker, A silent warning. I quit my job that day. I sold everything I owned and moved as far away as possible. For 5 years, I've carried the weight of what I saw. Those tapes, those experiments, they haunt me every time I close my eyes. I'm telling you this now because I can't keep it inside any longer. Whatever you do, if you ever come across something you're not meant to see, leave it alone. The trauma doesn't go away. It lingers day by day, and I don't know how much longer I can bear it.